The air smelled like scorched copper and ozone, the kind of smell that lives in the back of your throat long after you leave the room. Somewhere below deck, metal groaned against metal, a long, tired sound like a ship remembering it was built to survive worse than this. A single drop of coolant fell from a cracked pipe and hit the floor in rhythm with a heartbeat that wasn't slowing down no matter how hard she tried to control it. Princess Valerin of the Threen Dominion sat with her wrists bound in polymer restraints, back pressed against a bulkhead that used to hum with the songs of her people's engines and now only groaned. 6 armed mercenaries stood between her and the nearest airlock. She had counted the guns. She had counted the exits. None of the numbers came out in her favor. 91 light-years away, on a rock the Threen called the Wet World, and humans called home, a man named Eli Rourke was lying on his back under a delivery truck with a wrench in his teeth, trying to convince a rusted bolt that its retirement had come. He was not a soldier. He was not a diplomat. He had grease under his fingernails that hadn't come out since the Clinton administration and a knee that clicked like a metronome every time it rained. 6 months ago, he'd been quietly discharged from Earth's fledgling planetary defense corps. Not dishonorably, nothing so dramatic, just a polite, bureaucratic, your services are no longer required, after he disagreed loudly with a superior officer about how you don't leave men behind to save fuel. He fixed trucks now. He fixed refrigeration units. He fixed anything that held still long enough. He did not know, lying there with grease on his cheek and a bolt finally giving way with a satisfying crack, that in 4 hours a car with government plates would pull into the lot, and that his life was about to become extremely, catastrophically interesting. The shop he worked out of belonged to a man named Duarte, who paid him in cash on Fridays and never once asked why a former field medic with planetary defense clearance was spending his days replacing brake lines instead of drawing a pension. Eli liked it that way. Trucks didn't ask you to explain yourself. Trucks didn't care what you used to be, only whether your hands still worked, and whether you were willing to lie on cold concrete for 3 hours to find out why a fuel line was weeping instead of leaking clean. His apartment, 4 blocks from the shop, had a window unit that rattled and a couch that had come with the place, and a single framed photo on the wall of 6 men in fatigues, 5 of whom he still called on birthdays and 1 of whom he didn't, because that one hadn't made it home from a rescue op that command had called off 20 minutes too early to save fuel and paperwork. Eli had said some things about that decision in a debrief room that weren't technically insubordination, according to the official record, but were close enough that nobody argued very hard when his contract quietly wasn't renewed. He didn't regret it. That was the part people never quite believed when he told them. He didn't regret a single word of it, even 6 months later, even lying under a truck on a Tuesday with nothing to show for the decision except a smaller paycheck and a knee that ached worse in the cold. Some math you didn't need to redo. Some costs you paid once and then you were simply done paying them. The ledger closed, the guilt filed somewhere you didn't have to look at it every day. He thought about all of that briefly, distantly, the way you think about whether in a country you used to live in, and then the bolt gave way, and he stopped thinking about anything except the job in front of him, because that was the other thing trucks were good for. They didn't leave room for much else. A man in a borrowed suit. The car was black, government tissue, the kind that always seemed to idle a little too smoothly, like it was embarrassed to be there. 2 people got out. One wore a suit that fit. One wore a suit that clearly belonged to someone else, too long in the sleeve, tight across the shoulders, the kind of thing you grab out of a closet at 4 in the morning because someone told you there wasn't time to get your own. Eli Rourke, the suit that fit, asked. Depends who's asking and whether I owe them money. Eli wiped his hands on a rag that had given up being white sometime around 2019. Colonel Ray's, Earth Unified Defense Liaison. She didn't offer a hand, people like her rarely did. We need you to come with us. I'm retired from that. You were discharged. Same thing with better severance. Reyes didn't smile, but something in her jaw shifted, like she'd decided this was going to be one of those conversations. The Threen Dominion's royal envoy contacted Earth 4 hours ago. Their princess was taken hostage by a mercenary group called the Vantic Combine during a diplomatic transit through neutral space. The Threen believe He Combine wants to trigger a war between the Dominion and the coalition species, us included, by staging it to look like human involvement. Okay, tragic. Not my department, I fix trucks. The Combine's demand is specific. They want one human, unarmed, sent alone to retrieve her. No weapons, no escort, no fleet. If Earth sends a military response, they execute her and broadcast footage blaming humanity across every coalition channel. If Earth refuses to send anyone, they do it anyway and blame us for indifference. Either way, we're at war with a species 11 times our size within the week. So send someone who isn't me. We tried. Every officer who volunteered got rejected by the Combine's verification protocol. They're not stupid, they know a soldier when they scan one. Enhanced reflexes, tactical implants, service records. Their sensors flag it instantly. Reyes finally reached into her jacket and produced a data tablet, sliding it toward him. You have no augmentations. No combat record that reads as combat. Your service file lists you as maintenance and field medic support. You're 51 years old, 5'10". No cybernetics, bad knee, mild hearing loss in your left ear from an engine backfire in 2011. On paper, you are the least threatening human being with security clearance in the Sol system. Eli looked at the tablet, then at her, then back at the tablet. That's supposed to be flattering. It's supposed to keep a princess alive and stop a war, Reyes said. You in or not. He looked at the truck he hadn't finished. He thought about the men he hadn't been allowed to go back for 6 months and a lifetime ago. He thought, absurdly, about how he hadn't eaten lunch. Give me 20 minutes to grab my tool bag, he said. You won't be allowed weapons. Didn't say I needed weapons. He wiped his hands one more time, and this time the rag came away almost clean. Said I needed my tool bag. Boarding alone. The shuttle that took him up wasn't military. It was borrowed, a civilian transport repainted in a hurry, because anything with Earth defense markings would have violated the Combine's terms before he even left the atmosphere. Reyes rode with him as far as the transfer point, a derelict trading platform drifting in neutral space between 3 systems that all pretended not to be watching. Once you cross into their ship, we lose real-time contact, she told him. We'll have a relay buoy nearby, but if it goes dark, we won't know until it's over. Comforting. I'm not going to lie to you, Rourke. Everyone in this building thinks you're walking into a coffin. I think you're walking into a coffin. I just think you're the only coffin they'll let through the door. You have a gift for pep talks. I have a gift for triage, she said. You don't send your strongest asset into a fight you can't win. You send the one who might, by some miracle, do something nobody expected. She held out a hand this time. He shook it. Her grip was firmer than her voice. Bring her back, Rourke. I'll bring myself back too, if that's all right. That would be a nice bonus, she said, and it was almost a joke. The airlock cycled. On the other side stood a Threen mercenary in matte black plate armor, easily 7.5 feet of him, shoulders wide enough to fill the frame of the door twice over. His skin had the faint blue-gray sheen of something that lived somewhere colder and heavier than Earth, and his eyes, 3 of them, arranged in a shallow triangle across his brow, tracked Eli the way a man might track an insect he was deciding whether to bother stepping on. You are the human, the mercenary said. His voice had no contractions in it, no slang, no warmth, every word placed like a brick. You do not look capable of retrieving anything. You do not look capable of surviving the walk to the interior. I get that a lot, Eli said, and hefted his tool bag onto his shoulder. The mercenary's 3 eyes flicked to the bag. What is contained within? Tools. You were informed no weapons would be permitted. "These aren't weapons," Eli said, and meant it mostly. "They're wrenches." The mercenary considered this with the slow, deliberate patience of something that had never once in its life needed to hurry, then stepped aside. "Walk. You have 4 hours before the deadline. If you are not standing before Commander Threx with the correct verification code by then, the princess dies, and you will die shortly after, though far less quickly. Real hospitable operation you've got here." The mercenary said nothing. It didn't need to. The silence did the talking, and the silence was not friendly. Eli had been in tight spots before: burning vehicles, collapsed structures, the particular airless panic of a man bleeding out under a chassis that had pinned him. But there was something different about walking, alone, into a place built entirely by hands he'd never shaken, breathing air that had been recycled through lungs that weren't lungs at all in any sense he recognized. The gravity here ran slightly heavier than Earth's, just enough that his knee complained about it within the first 100 meters, and the light had a faint violet cast to it that made every shadow look a shade wrong, like a photograph that had been developed in the wrong chemicals. He kept his pace steady anyway. He'd learned, a long time ago, patching men up in the back of transports that were taking fire, that panic was contagious and calm was too, and the only real choice you got to make in a bad situation was which one you were going to spread. So he walked like a man walking to work, because in every way that mattered to him right then, that's exactly what he was doing. The long walk. The interior of the Combine ship was built for bodies twice human size. Every corridor felt like walking through the ribcage of something enormous and long dead. Ceilings arched 30 feet overhead, lighting strips embedded in the walls casting everything in a flat, clinical blue-white that made Eli's shadow look thin and lost. He passed 3 more guards on the way in, each of them pausing to look at him the way you'd look at something that had wandered onto the wrong property. One of them, younger, if the smoother plating on his face meant anything, actually laughed, a short bark of a sound. "This is Earth's champion," the young one said to no one in particular. "This frail thing. I could break him with one hand and not notice I had done it." "You are welcome to try," said an older guard nearby, "and lose your posting when Threx discovers you have violated the terms before he has finished enjoying them." Eli kept walking. His knee clicked with every third step, loud in the quiet, and he let it. Let them hear it. Let them think whatever they wanted. He'd learned a long time ago, working under trucks that outweighed him 40-1, that being underestimated by something heavy was not the same thing as being weak in front of it. It just meant you had to be smarter about which parts of the machine you touched. The corridor opened into a wide chamber, a former cargo bay, by the look of the mag clamps still bolted into the floor, now converted into something between a throne room and a holding cell. Princess Valerin sat in the center of it, restrained to a support column, her royal sash torn and her posture very deliberately straight despite everything. She was smaller than the mercenaries around her. Threen royalty ran leaner than their soldier caste, with skin a paler blue, near silver, and eyes that were doing a very good job of looking calm, and a much worse job of hiding the fear underneath it. At the center of the chamber, on a raised dais that had clearly once held cargo manifests, and now held a mercenary the size of a small building, stood Commander Threx. He was not simply large. He was large the way a tectonic plate is large, a presence you felt in the floor before you saw it with your eyes. Armor plates layered over what looked like solid muscle from throat to boot, a face carved from something that had never once needed to smile to get what it wanted, and a voice, when it came, that didn't rise to be heard. It didn't need to. "So," Threx said, "Earth's answer to a princess's life is a mechanic." "Word travels fast," Eli said. "You are aware," Threx continued, ignoring him entirely, "that this arrangement exists to prove a point. The Coalition believes humanity to be a rising power, capable, worth courting as allies, I intend to demonstrate in front of every camera drone I have positioned around this chamber that humanity is in fact what it has always been beneath its posturing, fragile, small, prey that has forgotten temporarily that it is prey. You've got a lot riding on me being bad at my job. Threx's three eyes narrowed, the closest thing to genuine reaction Eli had gotten out of anyone since he boarded. You misunderstand the terms. You are not here to fight for her release. You are here to earn it. There are trials ahead of you, human. 3 to start. Should you complete them, which you will not, the princess is yours to take. Should you fail any one of them, she dies where she sits, and the footage of your failure will be distributed to every species in the coalition as proof that humanity sent its best, and its best was nothing at all. And if I say no thanks, I'd rather just walk over there and untie her. Then my men shoot you both, and I claim you attempted violence in violation of the terms, Threx said, with the flat satisfaction of a man who had already planned for every branch of this conversation. There is no version of this room in which you simply walk out with her, human. You will earn this, or you will die pretending you could. Eli looked at the princess. She looked back at him with an expression that was trying very hard to say don't, and failing to hide the part of her that was saying please. He set his toolbag down slowly, unzipped it, and looked inside like a man taking inventory of exactly what he had to work with. "All right," he said, "let's see what you've got." The first trial heat. The first trial was a room. 2 guards marched Eli into a sealed chamber roughly the size of a school gymnasium, its far wall lined with a bank of industrial heat coils that hummed to life the moment the door sealed behind him. Threx's voice came through a speaker embedded somewhere in the ceiling. This chamber is calibrated to the internal temperature of a Threen forge world, 130 of your degrees Fahrenheit, and rising. You will cross to the opposite door in under 20 minutes, or the atmosphere will continue climbing until your body ceases to function. This is not cruelty, human. This is simply the temperature at which my people work a full shift without complaint. If you cannot survive an environment we consider merely uncomfortable, what use would you ever be to anyone? The floor was already warm through his boots. Eli felt sweat prick up along his hairline within 30 seconds, then down his back, then everywhere all at once, his body doing the thing bodies do. He didn't run. Running would cook him faster, more heat generated, more oxygen burned. He walked, controlled, breathing through his nose, and let his skin do what it had been doing since before his species had learned to make fire, let alone survive next to industrial coils built by something else's engineers. By minute 3, his shirt had gone from damp to soaked, and he could feel the fabric sticking to his spine with every step. By minute 6, the air itself had started to shimmer above the coils, distorting the far door into something that looked further away than it had a moment before, a mirage stretched thin across 100 meters of superheated deck plating. His pulse thudded in his ears, a fast, insistent rhythm that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with a body doing the math on how much longer it could keep this up. He thought, absurdly, of every summer he'd spent under a truck in a shop with no working air conditioning, sweat dripping into his eyes, Duarte yelling at him from the office to hurry up because a customer was waiting. He thought of desert deployments, humidity you could chew, the specific misery of body armor in 110-degree heat. None of it had been fun. All of it, apparently, had been training he never asked for and never got paid extra for, and was, right now, worth more than every dollar he hadn't been paid. By minute 10, his shirt was soaked through and his vision had gone soft at the edges, heat pressing down like a hand on the back of his neck. He kept walking, somewhere behind the observation glass, because of course there was observation glass. This was a demonstration, not a trial. He could hear muffled voices, betting pools forming in a language he didn't speak but recognized the tone of anywhere. He didn't need the translation. Money sounded the same everywhere, apparently, even when it was riding on whether or not he was about to die. He reached the far door at 17 minutes and 40 seconds, dripping, dizzy, and very much alive, and pressed his palm against the release panel with a hand that was shaking only a little. The door hissed open. On the other side, Threx was waiting, three eyes doing the math. "You sweated through your garments," Threx said, like it was an accusation. "Yeah, that's the point," Eli managed between breaths. "Body cools itself. Y'all got fur or scales or whatever under that armor." "Chitinous plating," Threx said. "We do not sweat." "So how do your soldiers cool off in a heat like that?" "They endure it. Discomfort is a test of will, not a biological event to be managed." Eli wiped his face with the back of a hand that came away soaked. "Might want to look into that," he said. "Wasting a lot of energy enduring what my body just handles for free." Threx's jaw tightened, not anger, exactly, something colder and more careful, the look of a man recalculating an equation he'd assumed was settled. "The second trial will not be so forgiving," he said, and turned, armor plates shifting like tectonic slabs, and walked away without waiting to see if the human could keep up. The second trial distance. The second trial took place outside the ship, on a tethered platform anchored to the hull, inside a bubble of atmosphere held together by a containment field that hummed at a frequency Eli could feel in his teeth. Below them, absolutely nothing, the black between stars, indifferent and endless. "A pursuit trial," Threx announced, standing at the platform's edge, unbothered by the void at his back the way only something that had never once doubted its own footing could be. "One of my soldiers will run the perimeter course, 12 kilometers marked by beacon. You will run it as well. Should you fail to finish within the time it takes him to finish twice, you fail the trial." "Twice?" "My soldiers are capable of sustained sprinting speeds your species cannot approach. This should not take long." The soldier selected for the demonstration was built like a sprinter, genetically designed for exactly this. Long-limbed, dense-muscled, already vibrating with barely restrained kinetic energy at the starting beacon. He looked at Eli with something between pity and boredom. "I will lap you within the first 2 kilometers, the soldier said. "There is no dishonor in this. Your body was not made for distance." "Funny," Eli said, rolling his bad knee in a slow circle, feeling it click. "'Cause mine was built for exactly that. Just maybe not the way you mean it." The beacon sounded. The soldier exploded off the line like something fired from a weapon, and within 90 seconds he was a shrinking dot against the curve of the hull, moving at a pace that would have put an Olympic sprinter to shame. Eli started at a jog. An easy, metronomic, boring jog, the kind you'd use to warm up before doing anything real, the kind that had gotten him through 2 decades of early mornings, and a body that had never once been the fastest thing in any room. He didn't chase the soldier's pace. He didn't try to match it. He just kept his rhythm, breath in through the nose, out through the mouth, 4 counts each way, boots striking the deck plating in a rhythm so steady it could have been a metronome. By the 2-kilometer mark, just as promised, the soldier blew past him, already on his second lap of that segment, moving at a speed that made Eli's jog look like standing still. The soldier didn't even glance over. By kilometer 4, the soldier's pace had dropped. Not much, just a fraction. A human eye might have missed it. Eli didn't. He'd spent a lifetime listening to engines for the half-second before something started to fail. By kilometer 7, the soldier was visibly laboring, chest heaving, that dense sprinter's musculature working against him now instead of for him. All that explosive fast-twitch fiber screaming for oxygen his body hadn't evolved to deliver at this duration. Threen physiology, Eli would learn much later from a very apologetic coalition biologist. Ran hot and burned fast, built for short, brutal bursts of violence, not the long, grinding patience of a chase across open ground. On their homeworld, prey didn't run for 12 kilometers. Prey didn't run at all, usually, because there wasn't time. Eli kept his own pace exactly where it had been at the starting beacon, unchanged, unbothered, because that was the whole trick of it. the thing nobody watching seemed to understand yet. This wasn't a race he was trying to win in the way they thought a race got won. He wasn't racing the soldier at all. He was racing the clock, and the clock didn't care how fast you went in the first 2 kilometers, only whether you were still moving in the 12th. He'd learned that lesson the hard way once, years ago, chasing a mile time in basic training that had left him doubled over and useless for the obstacle course that followed it, and had spent every training cycle since relearning the same simple, boring, unglamorous truth. The tortoise story wasn't a fable. It was just physiology, dressed up as a moral so kids would remember it. Humans, on the other hand, had spent a few 100,000 years running things to death on the African savanna, not because they were fast, but because nothing else on that plain could sweat and breathe and keep its heart rate steady for 6 straight hours while the thing it was chasing overheated and collapsed. It wasn't a skill. It was just what the body did quietly in the background, while the mind complained about being tired. Eli finished his single lap at 9 kilometers per hour, breathing easy right as the soldier, vomiting now, legs shaking, having completed a lap and a half of his own, finally staggered across the beacon and went down on one knee, 3 eyes wide with something that had never once, in his entire genetically optimized life, been asked of him before: doubt. Threx watched the whole thing without a word. When Eli crossed the final beacon, unhurried, sweat-soaked but steady, the commander's jaw worked once, silently, like he was chewing on a fact he didn't want to swallow. "That was not strength," Threx said finally. "Nope," Eli agreed, hands on his knees, catching his breath. "Wasn't trying to be strong, just trying to still be standing at the end. Different game." "You cheated the metric." "I ran the course you gave me," Eli said. "Nobody said I had to run it your way." An unscheduled trial. Between the second trial and the third, there was a delay, deliberate, Eli suspected, meant to let his body seize up, let the exhaustion of the run settle deep into muscle before anyone asked anything else of him. He used the time to sit against a bulkhead, drink water from a canteen a guard had reluctantly handed over, and take inventory of High's own hands, which had started to shake in the particular fine tremor of a body running low on everything it needed to keep going. It was during that lull that the ship's environmental system failed. Not dramatically, no explosion, no alarm at first, just a slow drop in the hum of the air recyclers 2 decks up, a sound so background that Eli only noticed it because his ears had spent 30 years listening for exactly that kind of silence, the specific quiet of a machine that has stopped doing its job. He sat up straighter. "Something's wrong with your air system," he said, to no one in particular, and then louder to the guard nearest him. "Your recyclers, listen, they just changed pitch." The guard looked at him like he'd started speaking in tongues. Word must have traveled fast, though, because within 2 minutes Threx himself arrived, 3 eyes narrowed, an engineer trailing behind him with a data slate already lit up with warning icons neither of them seemed to be able to parse fast enough. "A coolant valve has frozen in the primary recycler," the engineer reported, voice tight. "The system is venting atmosphere into a maintenance crawlspace instead of cycling it. We have perhaps 40 minutes before breathable air on this deck falls below safe thresholds. Repair crews are still 6 hours out from rendezvous." "You don't have a backup?" Eli asked. "The backup requires the primary valve to be manually reset, which requires entering the crawlspace, which is currently venting atmosphere at negative pressure and sub-zero temperature," the engineer said. "We have lost 2 technicians to that valve in the past. It is considered, at this point, a design flaw we intend to replace rather than repair." "You don't have 40 minutes to replace anything," Eli said, already getting to his feet, joints protesting loudly. "Where's the crawlspace?" Threx's eyes flicked to him, unreadable. "This is not one of the trials, human. You are not obligated to involve yourself." Yeah, well, I'm also not obligated to stand here and listen to people suffocate over a stuck valve when I've fixed exactly this kind of problem 40 times on Earth, just with different plumbing. Eli grabbed his bag. Show me the valve. The crawl space was barely large enough for him to move through on his stomach, the cold hitting immediately and viciously, the kind of cold that didn't just chill you, but seemed to reach into your joints and start disassembling them one at a time. Frost had already formed along the frozen valve's housing, thick and jagged, and the wind, actual wind, howling through a system never meant to carry it, screamed past his ears loud enough to drown out the engineer's voice in his earpiece. He worked by feel more than sight, fingers going numb inside thin gloves that had never been designed for anything like this, using a heat gun from his bag on its lowest setting to slowly, carefully coax the frozen mechanism back into motion without cracking the housing from thermal shock. Too much heat too fast, and the metal would fracture, venting the whole compartment catastrophically. Too little, and the ice would never budge before the deadline. It was the same principle as thawing a frozen brake line in a Minnesota winter, just with worse consequences for getting it wrong, and colder hands, and no radio station playing quietly in the background to keep him company. By the time the valve finally gave, swinging free with a groan of relieved metal, Eli's fingers had gone from numb to burning to numb again, and frostbite had started blooming pale and waxy across two knuckles he wouldn't be able to feel properly for weeks. He didn't notice until he was back in the main corridor, breathing warm air again, and someone pointed at his hand with visible alarm. "You are injured," Threx said. "I'm fine," Eli said, flexing fingers that didn't want to flex. "Air's flowing again, that's what matters." "That is frostbite. On my world, an injury like that ends a soldier's usefulness for a full season." "On my world we just wrap it and keep working," Eli said, already digging through his bag for gauze. "Body parts complain, don't mean they've quit." Threx watched him wrap his own hand with the brisk, practiced indifference of a man who had done it 100 times before, and said nothing else, but something in his posture had shifted again, the calculation behind his eyes running one more unplanned variable through whatever equation he was building about the frail, sweating, endlessly inconvenient human standing in front of him. The third trial, blood. The third trial had no announcement beforehand. That was, Eli would come to understand the point. He was escorted back into the cargo bay throne room, where the princess still sat bound to her column, watching him with an expression that had shifted somewhere in the last hour from resignation to something more dangerous, hope, cautious and unwelcome, the kind that hurts worse if it's wrong. "Thr." X descended from his dais and without ceremony, drew a short energy blade from his hip and drove it, almost lazily, through the meat of his own forearm, through his own arm, not Eli's, and pulled it free, dark blue-black blood welling immediately from the wound. "What the hell?" Eli said, before he could stop himself. "The third trial is not combat," Threx said, voice unbothered by the wound in a way that made Eli's skin crawl. "It is treatment. You claim your species serves a function beyond soldiering, that some of you are healers, tenders of the wounded. Your service record lists field medic support. Prove it is not a lie. Close this wound before I bleed out, using only what is in that bag, and I will consider it done honestly." "You just stabbed yourself to test me." "I have survived worse for less reason," Threx said. "Work quickly, human. My blood does not clot the way yours does. You have perhaps 4 minutes before this becomes fatal." Eli didn't waste time being angry about it. He'd learned that anger burned oxygen you needed for thinking. He dropped to his knees beside the wound, tore open his bag, and started working the way he'd worked on 100 half-dead engines, and 6 months ago and a lifetime ago on men who were bleeding out in places far worse than this, using wire strippers as makeshift forceps, a soldering iron's heat setting to cauterize what he could reach, a roll of insulated tape and a strip of shirt fabric as pressure dressing, all of it improvised, none of it textbook, every bit of it working because it had to. The blood coming out of the wound was darker than anything he'd trained on, near black where human blood ran bright, and it moved differently too, thinner, faster, sheeting off the wound edge in a way that told him whatever clotting factors it did of weren't going to help him buy time. He pressed 2 fingers against the brachial equivalent. He was guessing it based on the wound's position and Threx's own tensed reaction. Found something that might have been a pressure point by the way the flow visibly slowed, and held it there with his whole forearm shaking from the effort of maintaining pressure, while his other hand kept working. "Talk to me," he said, mostly to keep Threx's attention on something other than the fact that he was dying by inches on the deck plating. "Your kind got a name for whatever this vessel runs through here, closest to an artery." "We call it the deep current," Threx managed, voice tighter now, strained around the edges in a way it hadn't been even during his own self-inflicted wound. "It runs closer to the bone than your equivalent. I did not account for how deep the blade would travel. I intended a demonstration. I did not intend to test the trial's cost against my own life." "Yeah, well, that tends to happen with self-inflicted stab wounds, funnily enough," Eli said, hands moving fast now, guided as much by instinct as by any training that had ever covered alien physiology. Because none of it had, none of it could have, and he was building the map as he went. The way he built every repair he'd ever done on a system he didn't have documentation for. Listen to what it's telling you. Trust the parts that make sense. Improvise the rest. And don't stop moving your hands long enough to second-guess it. "Your blood pressure's dropping too fast for basic pressure," he muttered, mostly to himself, pressing the makeshift dressing hard against the wound with one hand while his other dug for anything that might slow the bleeding further. "You said it doesn't clot right. Why?" "An evolutionary trait," Threx said, voice tightening now, the first crack of real strain in it. "We heal quickly once repaired. We do not clot to prevent infection from sealing beneath the wound. It is a trade-off my people accept." "Great, so you bleed like a stuck hydraulic line until somebody physically seals it." Eli grabbed the soldering iron, thumbed it to its highest heat setting, and looked up at Threx with the flattest, most unimpressed expression he'd worn all day. "This is gonna hurt like hell, and I want it on record I didn't design your biology this stupid." "Do it," Threx said, and didn't flinch when Eli pressed the glowing tip to the worst of the wound, the smell of it filling the chamber, sharp and awful, Threx's whole massive frame going rigid but silent, not one sound of complaint escaping him. It took 2 minutes and 40 seconds. When Eli finally sat back, hands shaking, shirt sleeve torn off and wrapped tight around the commander's forearm as a final pressure bandage, Threx flexed his fingers slowly, testing the seal, and looked down at the human kneeling in a puddle of his own blood with an expression that had, for the first time since Eli had boarded this ship, lost every trace of contempt. "You did not hesitate," Threx said quietly. "Didn't have time to. You could have let me bleed. I gave you every excuse. No one would have blamed you." "Yeah, well." Eli sat back on his heels, wiping his hands on what was left of his shirt. "That's not really how the job works. You don't get to pick who's worth saving in the moment. You just save what's in front of you and feel weird about it later." Threx looked down at the bandage on his arm for a long moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, in front of every soldier in that cargo bay, and every camera drone recording it for the coalition feeds waiting outside, he knelt. Not far, not long, but he knelt, bringing his head level with Eli's, 3 eyes meeting too, and set his energy blade flat on the deck plating between them, hilt turned toward the human, the closest thing, Eli would later learn, that Threen military culture had to a surrender of arms. "You have earned the 3rd trial," Threx said, "and more besides." A kneeling giant. Around the chamber, guards who 10 minutes earlier had been laughing at the frail human now stood very still, watching their commander kneel to something they'd been told, their entire careers, could be broken with one hand. The princess, for her part, had gone quiet in a different way, not fear quiet, but the stillness of someone recalculating everything they thought they understood about the small, sweat-soaked man who'd walked into a room built to kill him, and instead spent his last ounce of energy on the wound of the man trying to kill him. "Get up," Eli said, a little uncomfortable with the whole tableau. "You're bigger than my truck. I don't need you kneeling at me." Threx rose, and something in his posture had changed. Not softened, exactly. Threen's soldiers didn't do soft, but recalibrated, like a man who'd been running a piece of faulty math his whole career and had just watched someone else solve it in real time. "You misunderstand the gesture. It is not gratitude for the wound. It is acknowledgement. I constructed 3 trials to expose the weakness of your kind. Heat, endurance, and the willingness to sacrifice for something that offers no benefit to yourself. You did not merely survive them. You exposed the weakness in my understanding instead." "Look, I appreciate the character growth," Eli said, already moving toward the princess, pulling a multi-tool from his bag to work on the restraint locks. "But we're kind of on a clock here, and I'd like to get her back to her people before." The chamber's lighting shifted. Every strip along the walls flared amber, then red, and a klaxon began pulsing somewhere deep in the ship's structure, low and insistent. Threx's head came up sharply, all 3 eyes narrowing toward the ceiling as if he could see through it to whatever had triggered the alarm. "That is not a trial signal," he said. "Then what is it?" "Perimeter breach," said one of the guards, reading something off a wrist display, and the tension in his voice was nothing like the bored contempt from earlier. "Unidentified fleet signature decelerating from the outer marker. 22 vessels. Weapons hot." "Whose fleet?" Threx demanded. The guard's 3 eyes flicked up, and for the first time since Eli had boarded, he saw real fear on a Threen face. "They are broadcasting Vantic Combine command codes, sir, but the authentication is forged. It is not one of ours." The second trap. Threx went very still in the particular way. Large, dangerous things go still right before they stop being still at all. "Explain," he said. "The fleet is broadcasting a message meant for the Coalition Relay Network," the guard continued, reading fast now. "It states that Threen mercenary forces, quote, executed the human envoy after extracting information under torture, and are now preparing to execute Princess Valerin as well, framing the act as sanctioned Dominion policy. They are requesting immediate coalition intervention against Threen holdings." "That's a lie," Eli said. "You haven't executed anybody." "I am aware of that," Threx said, voice gone flat and dangerous. "The fleet approaching is aware of that as well. They do not care. They intend to destroy this vessel, kill everyone aboard, myself, my soldiers, the princess, and you, and broadcast the footage of our wreckage as proof of the accusation before anyone can contradict it. A war started not with a lie believed, but with a lie that outlives everyone who could deny it." It clicked into place in Eli's head with the particular cold clarity of watching a bad engine finally reveal which part had actually failed. "This was never about testing me," he said slowly. "The trials, the deadline, all of it, that's not the Combine's real plan. It's a delay. They needed time to get that fleet in position while everyone's watching me run around sweating in a hot room." "Astute," Threx said grimly. "Belatedly so, but astute." "So who's actually behind the fake fleet?" "I do not know," Threx admitted, and it clearly cost him something to say it. "But I intend to survive long enough to find out, and that requires this ship's shields hold, which they will. Not against 22 vessels, for longer than 11 minutes. The klaxon pulsed again. Somewhere far below them, Eli felt the deck shudder, not an impact yet, just the ship's engine spooling up to something closer to their limits, straining against a threat they weren't built to survive. Eli looked at the restraint locks on the princess's wrists, still half open under his multi-tool. He looked at Threx, at the guards now scrambling toward battle stations with none of the swagger they'd carried an hour ago. He looked, finally, at his own toolbag, sitting open on the deck plating, half empty, smelling faintly of soldering flux and blood. "Okay," he said. "New plan. Somebody get me to this ship's shield control right now." Reading the machine. The shield control room was smaller than Eli expected. A cramped nest of consoles and cabling tucked behind 3 layers of blast doors, manned by a single harried Threen engineer who looked up at the human striding in with a tool bag like he'd been asked to accept delivery of a very confusing package. "Explain your systems to me," Eli said. "Fast. Where's your power draw coming from, what's your redundancy look like, and what's your weakest emitter array?" "Why would I explain shield architecture to a human maintenance worker?" the engineer said, though with considerably less conviction than the guards from earlier had managed. "Because your commander just watched me cauterize his arm with a soldering iron and knelt on the floor about it, and I'm guessing words traveling fast," Eli said. "And because in about 10 minutes you're gonna have 22 ships trying to kill everyone on this vessel, and I've got an idea that might buy you time, but only if I understand what I'm looking at." Threx, who had followed him in, put a hand gently for something the size of a small vehicle on the engineer's shoulder. "Tell him," he said, "whatever you know." The engineer talked. Eli listened, following cable runs with his eyes, checking power distribution readouts against the layout of the room, doing the thing he'd done 1,000 times under 1,000 trucks, not memorizing the system, but understanding the shape of it, where the strain would show up first, where a smart man with limited tools could make the biggest possible difference with the least amount of material. "Your shield's drawing from a single primary reactor with 3 redundant relay nodes," Eli said slowly, thinking out loud. "Which is smart until somebody targets all 3 relays at once, which 22 coordinated ships absolutely will, and then your shield doesn't degrade gracefully. It just drops all at once because none of your nodes are cross-linked to share load." "That is correct," the engineer said, surprised despite himself. It was considered an acceptable risk against typical raiding parties, which do not coordinate targeting that precisely. "Yeah, well, whoever's out there isn't a typical raiding party." Eli was already pulling tools from his bag, laying them out on the console like a surgeon prepping instruments. "Can you cross-link the relay nodes manually? Physically reroute the power conduits so if one drops, the other 2 auto-compensate?" "Theoretically. It would require rewiring 3 separate junction points simultaneously, under fire, in less time than we currently have." "Not 3 separate people. One person who's fast and knows what a junction box looks like scared, which, trust me, I do." Eli grabbed a headset off the console, tossed it to the engineer. "You talk me through the wiring schematics from here. I'll physically make the crosslink happen at each node." "Threx, I need your biggest, least breakable soldiers running interference if anybody tries to stop us. And I need eyes on that fleet's targeting pattern the second they open fire, because I've only got one shot at timing this right." Threx looked at him for a long moment. This small, ordinary, sweat-soaked human giving orders in a command room full of soldiers 11 times his mass, none of whom, Eli noticed, were laughing anymore. "Do it," Threx said, and the room moved. 3 nodes, 1 chance. The first relay node was in a maintenance crawlspace 2 decks down, and Eli got there running, Threen guards clearing the corridor ahead of him like a wedge, the ship shuddering harder now under the first probing shots from the approaching fleet. Not a full assault yet, just testing fire, the calm before the real storm. He tore the access panel off the junction box with his bare hands, ripped his knuckles doing it, didn't stop to notice. The engineer's voice crackled in his ear, walking him through color-coded conduits in a language he didn't speak, but numbers and colors translated fine across any species. "Red primary, blue secondary, cross them at the coupling, not the source, the coupling, or you'll blow the whole relay." "Working on it." His hands were shaking, adrenaline and exhaustion both catching up to him at once. 3 trials and a sprint, and now this. splicing alien wiring with fingers that had gone numb somewhere around the second heat trial and never quite recovered. He forced them steady the way he always did: breathe in, 4 counts, breathe out, 4 counts. Hands are just tools. Tools don't shake if you don't let them, and made the connection. The junction sparked once, hissed, and settled into a steady hum. "No one is live," the engineer said, disbelief plain in his voice. "Crosslink confirmed." "2 more to go," Eli said, already running for the ladder to the next deck, ribs aching from a fall he didn't remember taking, blood his own, this time, trickling from a cut above his eyebrow where he'd clipped the panel edge. The second node was worse. A fire had broken out nearby from a stray hit against the hull, and Eli worked through smoke thick enough to taste, coughing, eyes streaming, guided entirely by the engineer's voice, and the memory of the wiring diagram burned into his head from 30 seconds of looking at it. He burned his palm on a live conduit and kept working, because stopping meant the whole plan meant nothing, and there wasn't a version of this where he got to stop and be a person who felt pain about it later. Somewhere behind him, one of Threx's soldiers went down hard, caught by a secondary explosion venting from a ruptured coolant line, and Eli felt the impact of it in his own chest without turning to look, because turning to look wasn't going to help either of them, and the junction box in front of him wasn't going to finish itself. He'd learned that lesson too, a long time ago in a much worse place than this one, that you didn't get to stop and grieve in the middle of the job, not because the grief didn't matter, but because stopping meant more people joined the count before you got the chance to grieve any of them properly. You paid that debt later alone, usually at 3 in the morning, staring at a ceiling. You didn't pay it now. His hands found the wiring by memory more than sight at this point, smoke stinging tears down his face, lungs burning with every breath, and somewhere in the haze he registered that his shirt sleeve had caught a spark and gone from smoking to actually burning, before he slapped it out against his own thigh without breaking rhythm on the splice. "Node 2, live," he gasped, and didn't wait to hear confirmation before he was moving again. The third node was in the worst spot of all, an exposed maintenance gantry near the outer hull, open to a viewport that showed, with horrible clarity, the approaching fleet's running lights growing steadily larger, weapons charging visibly along their hulls. Seconds away from the coordinated strike that would kill everyone on this ship the instant the shield's 3 unlinked nodes failed independently instead of together. Eli's hands found the junction box. His fingers, slicked with blood and sweat and conduit grease, fumbled the first connection. "You don't have time to be careful," Threx's voice came from behind him, the commander himself, having followed, standing in the gantry doorway with an energy weapon raised toward the approaching fleet, as if his own body could somehow slow 22 capital ships. "The fleet is opening fire in 11 seconds. "Not helping," Eli muttered, and forced his hand still one more time. 8 seconds. Red to blue, cross the coupling, not the source. 5 seconds. The wire slid home, the junction hissed, sparked, hummed. "Node 3 is." The fleet opened fire. The shield that should have failed. 22 ships fired in a coordinated pattern, designed to overload 3 independent relay nodes simultaneously, dropping the shield in a single decisive stroke, and exposing the ship's hull to a follow-up barrage that would have ended everything aboard in under 4 seconds. Instead, the shield held. Not perfectly. Eli felt the whole gantry lurch as energy discharge slammed against the hull, alarms screaming, sparks raining from an overhead conduit that hadn't quite finished its job of rerouting. But it held, because the 3 nodes he'd just cross-linked with bleeding hands and borrowed time were now sharing load instead of failing independently, each one picking up the slack when another staggered, exactly the way he'd promised the frightened engineer 3 decks up that they would. "Shield integrity holding at 31%, the engineer's voice crackled through, disbelieving. "They expected total failure. They are not adjusting their targeting. They don't know it worked yet." Then let's make sure they find out the hard way, Threx said. And there was something in his voice now that hadn't been there before, not contempt, not even respect exactly, but something closer to the particular fierce loyalty of a man who has just watched someone bleed for a cause that wasn't even theirs to begin with. He keyed his own comm. All batteries, return fire. Target their forward rel. I ships, the ones broadcasting the forged command codes. If we can capture even one alive, we can prove this attack did not originate from Dominion forces. The counterattack came fast and hard, Threen weapon systems finally given a target worth the effort, and the fake fleet, never actually built for a fair fight, only for a quick execution, began to scatter under return fire it hadn't planned for. Eli sagged against the gantry railing, hands shaking properly now that there was nothing left to steady them for, blood dripping from his eyebrow and his burned palm both, watching through the viewport as ships that had come to erase every witness to a lie now found themselves fighting for their lives against a shield that should have failed and didn't. "You did that," Threx said, looking at him. "We did that," Eli corrected, breathing hard. "I just know where the wires go." Proof in the wreckage. It took another 40 minutes for the fleet to break and scatter, most of the attacking ships fleeing into a jump corridor rather than risk capture, but not all of them made it. One crippled vessel, its engines disabled by a well-placed shot from Threx's own gunners, drifted dead in space close enough to board. What Eli and Threx found aboard it, once a boarding party cracked the hull, wasn't Threen at all, not Vantic Combine either, as it turned out. The crew were a mixed group of mercenaries for hire, working under a command structure that traced back, through 3 shell corporations and 1 very sloppily encrypted data core, to a coalition arms manufacturer that stood to profit enormously from a prolonged war between the Threen Dominion and the newly contacted human species. A war that would require, conveniently, a great deal of newly manufactured weaponry from precisely one supplier. They wanted the war, Threx said, reading the recovered data with 3 eyes narrowed into something dangerous, standing in the wreckage of the enemy bridge. Not to win it, just to sell the guns for it, on both sides. "Course they did," Eli said, tired down to his bones, sitting on an overturned crate because his legs had finally, quietly, decided they were done for the day. Nobody starts a war for free anymore. Somebody always makes money off the invoice. The engineer who'd traveled with them from the shield room had followed the boarding party across, and now crouched over the enemy data core with the focused intensity of someone finally getting to solve a puzzle instead of merely surviving one. "The financial trail is extensive," she reported, scrolling through decrypted ledgers. "Shell purchases routed through no fewer than 6 coalition trade registries, all converging on a single manufacturing consortium based in the perimeter systems. They have supplied munitions to 11 separate regional conflicts across the last 2 decades, sir. Every one of those conflicts began with an incident remarkably similar to this one. A provocation staged to look like it came from whichever party they intended to arm both sides against. 11 wars," Eli said quietly, "for invoices. The margins on a sustained multi-species conflict are considerable," the engineer said, with the flat distaste of someone reading numbers she wished she didn't understand as well as she did. "Weapons, armor, medical supplies, rebuilding contracts afterward. A single war between the Dominion and a newly contacted species like humanity would have been worth more to this consortium than a decade of peaceful trade." "This changes the terms entirely," Threx said. "The Combine's original demand, the trials, the deadline, that was never truly about testing your worth as a warrior human. It was cover. A delay mechanism, dressed up as tradition, to keep every camera in this sector pointed at you, sweating through a heat chamber while the actual threat maneuvered into position. The mercenaries who issued the challenge were likely paid separately from the fleet that arrived to finish it, 2 arms of the same plan, neither one needing to know the other existed." "Figured that part out a little late," Eli admitted. You figured it out in time, Threx said, which is more than the architects of this plan accounted for. They built their entire scheme around one assumption, that whoever Earth sent would either fail the trials and die quietly, or pass them and leave satisfied, unaware anything larger was in motion until the fleet's broadcast reached the coalition relay unopposed. They did not account for a mechanic who fixes environmental valves in his spare time and asks too many questions about frozen wiring. To be fair, Eli said, neither did I this morning. I was just trying to fix a truck. Threx made a sound that might, in a species with a wider vocal range, have been something close to a laugh. I am beginning to suspect, human, that you do not know how to do anything else. What the princess saw. Back aboard the main ship, Princess Valorin had been free. Ed of her restraints properly now, sitting upright with a blanket someone had finally thought to offer her, watching the whole aftermath unfold with the particular sharp attentiveness of someone who has spent her entire life being underestimated in rooms much like this one, and knows exactly what it looks like when the math finally comes out different than expected. You could have simply run the trials and left, she said, when Eli finally made his way back to her, favoring his burned hand, a fresh bandage over his eyebrow courtesy of Threx's medical officer, who had insisted with something almost like tenderness. Once Threx knelt, once the terms were satisfied, you had earned my release. The fleet's arrival was not your problem to solve. Kind of felt like it was, once it started shooting at the ship I was standing on. You could have taken an escape pod, left the Threen to fend for themselves against an enemy that was, after all, never truly yours. Could have, Eli agreed, sitting down heavily beside her, wincing as his knee clicked in protest. But then a couple hundred people who work for a guy who stabbed himself to test whether I'd help him die anyway, and who I then watched kneel on the floor of his own throne room in front of his own soldiers because I saved him instead. Those people would have died because I decided the job was technically over. Didn't feel like a great way to leave it. Valorin studied him for a long moment, silver-blue eyes taking in the burns and the blood and the exhaustion he wasn't bothering to hide anymore. I have been a hostage twice before this, she said, quieter now, the composed royal bearing slipping just slightly at the edges. Both times, the parties who came for me arrived with fleets, warships, declarations of retribution before the negotiation had even properly begun. It is, I am told, the customary way such matters are handled among the coalition's stronger species, force meeting force, so that no one mistakes restraint for weakness. And this time Earth sent one unarmed man with a bag of tools who spent the first hour of his arrival being laughed at by guards half his size in comparison, and the second hour patching up the very commander holding me captive. She shook her head slowly, something between disbelief and genuine warmth crossing her face. I confess, I did not know what to expect from that. I still am not entirely certain what to make of it, except that it worked, and that it worked in a way no fleet ever has. Yeah, well, fleets are expensive, Eli said, and I was already free that afternoon. My people have a saying, she said finally, that the measure of a species is not what it does when it is strong, but what it continues doing after it has already won, and no one would blame it for stopping. Sounds like a saying somebody smart came up with, Eli said. Might steal it. You may have earned that much, she said, and for the first time since he'd boarded, she smiled, a real one, tired and relieved and entirely unguarded. Nothing left of the composed mask she'd been wearing since the restraints first closed around her wrists. For what it is worth, Eli Rourke of Earth, I intend to tell this story for the rest of my reign, and I intend to tell it accurately, which I suspect will annoy you considerably, given how little credit you seem willing to take for any of it. Probably will, he agreed. Tell it anyway, just leave the part in where I complained the whole time. Wouldn't feel honest without that part. The long way home. The trip back to Earth's transfer platform took the better part of a day, Threx himself insisting on personally escorting the shuttle despite 3 separate protests from his own security detail, who apparently found the idea of their commander voluntarily spending extra hours near a human deeply, professionally confusing. "You do understand," Threx said, standing at the shuttle's viewport beside Eli as Earth's transfer platform grew from a speck to a shape in the dark. "That word of what happened aboard my ship has already reached the Coalition relay network. Every species with access to those broadcasts has now seen a Threen war commander kneel to an unarmed human maintenance worker. That gonna be a problem for you, career-wise." "It is going to be," Threx said, with something that might, on a human face, have been the beginning of a wry expression. "The single most requested piece of footage in Threen military history for the next several decades. My soldiers have already begun referring to you, unofficially, as the one who out-endured the endurance test. I am told several of them are attempting to replicate your sweating in the mess hall, without success, and with a great deal of complaint. Tell them not to bother. It's not a technique. It's just biology being annoyingly good at one specific thing." "I intend to," Threx said, "extensively in the after-action report. I also intend to recommend F. Ormally, that the Dominion pursue a defensive alliance with Earth rather than the trade agreement originally proposed. Your species is small, fragile in the ways that matter to a blade or a fist. But you do not stop, and you do not calculate whether a cost is worth paying before you pay it. And in my professional experience, human, those two qualities together are considerably more dangerous than muscle." "That's supposed to be a compliment." "It is the closest my species comes to one," Threx said. "Take it before I reconsider." Eli laughed, tired and real, and didn't argue. "Can I ask you something?" Eli said after a while, watching the stars slide past the viewport in silence. "Back in the throne room, before any of this kicked off, you stabbed your own arm to test whether I'd help you. What would you have done if I hadn't?" Threx was quiet long enough that Eli thought he might not answer at all. "I would have let the wound close on its own, eventually, though not without significant blood loss and considerable pain," he said finally. "And I would have concluded that humanity was precisely what the Combine's employers wish the Coalition to believe, a species capable of watching another die for the sake of expedience, unworthy of alliance or trust. I would have executed the princess as scheduled and reported my findings honestly, believing them to be true. That's a hell of a thing to build a war on, one guy's bad afternoon." "It is," Threx agreed. "It is also, I am ashamed to admit, precisely how most first encounters between unfamiliar species are decided in this sector. Not through careful study or patient diplomacy, but through a single incident, magnified and broadcast, taken as proof of an entire species' character. You were fortunate that the incident chosen for you happened to reveal something true." "Wasn't fortune," Eli said. "Was just Tuesday, bad one but still just Tuesday." Threx made that same almost laugh sound again, low in his chest, armor plates shifting as he settled deeper into the observation seat that had clearly been built for something considerably larger than a human, and was, apparently, uncomfortably small even for him. "I have served in the Combine's ranks for 11 cycles," he said. "I have fought creatures with 3 hearts and creatures with none, species that breathe fire and species that breathe poison, warriors who could remove my head from my shoulders before I finished drawing a blade. I have never, in 11 cycles, knelt to any of them. I do not entirely understand why I knelt to you, human, except that it felt, in the moment, like the only honest thing left to do." "For what it's worth," Eli said, "I wasn't expecting it either. Kind of assumed you were gonna throw me out an airlock the second I stopped being useful." "The thought occurred to several of my officers," Threx admitted. "I am told it occurred to my second-in-command as recently as this morning. I informed him that any human capable of rewiring a dying warship's shields with a soldering iron and his own blood was worth considerably more alive than as a cautionary anecdote, and that he was welcome to disagree with me somewhere I could not hear him." "Diplomatic." "I have been told I am not known for diplomacy," Threx said. I am told since yesterday that I am now known for something else entirely. I have not yet decided how I feel about that. Testimony. 3 days later, before he was allowed to go home for good, Eli found himself standing in a coalition hearing chamber he had not been told existed until roughly 6 hours before he was expected to speak in it. A vast amphitheater built to seat delegates from over 40 member species, most of whom, Eli noted with the detached exhaustion of a man who had stopped being surprised by anything, were considerably larger than him, considerably stranger than him, and all of them, without exception, staring. Reyes stood beside him in a suit that fit her properly this time. "You don't have to say much," she murmured as the chamber quieted. "Just answer what they ask. Don't editorialize." "When have I ever editorialized?" "Constantly. It's kind of your whole thing." The presiding delegate, a tall, reed-thin being from a species Eli didn't recognize, robed in something that shimmered faintly like oil on water, called the chamber to order and turned 3 sets of compound eyes toward him. "Mr. Rourke," the delegate said, voice translated through an earpiece a half-second behind the movement of whatever passed for its mouth. "You have been asked here because your testimony, combined with the recovered data from the vessel your party disabled, forms the central evidence in what is likely to become the largest arms trafficking prosecution in coalition history. Before we proceed to the formal record, the chamber would like to understand something simpler. You were sent, alone, unarmed, into a hostile vessel with no assurance of survival, to retrieve a hostage F. Rama species, 11 times your species' documented physical capability. Why did you agree to go?" Eli thought about it for a second longer than the chamber probably expected, because it was, honestly, a decent question, and he figured it deserved better than a reflexive answer. Because somebody had to, and the people asking had already tried everybody who looked like the obvious choice, and none of those people were allowed through the door, he said finally. "I fix things for a living. Machines mostly. But the job's never really been about the machine. It's about the fact that something's broken and somebody needs it not to be. And usually there isn't a convenient version of that where the right guy for the job also happens to be well-rested and armed and confident about the outcome. Most of the time you just go, because waiting for the ideal circumstances is how things stay broken." A murmur passed through the chamber, translated in a dozen overlapping dialects Eli couldn't parse. "You do not consider yourself a soldier," the delegate said. "Yet you disabled an armed pursuit vessel, repaired critical shield infrastructure under fire, and treated a combat wound severe enough to be lethal within minutes. These are not, by any species definition, the actions of an ordinary tradesman." "With respect," Eli said, "I think you've got that backwards. That's exactly what an ordinary tradesman does when the thing in front of him is on fire and nobody else is coming. I didn't do anything up there I haven't done 100 times on Earth in some smaller, less dramatic version. Fixed a broken system under pressure. Patched somebody up who was bleeding. Kept moving when my legs told me to stop. None of that's special. It's just Tuesday if Tuesday goes badly enough." Commander Threx, seated in the gallery reserved for Threen observers, said nothing throughout the proceeding, but Eli caught him watching with an expression that, on a human face, might have been something close to pride, and on his was simply 3 eyes that didn't look away. The hearing lasted 4 more hours, most of it technical, data logs, financial trails, formal statements from the engineer and from Threx himself, corroborating every detail of the forged fleet and its true origin. And by the end of it, the presiding delegate formally recommended sanctions against the Arms Consortium's entire trade registry, along with what the translator rendered, somewhat awkwardly, as an expedited and favorable review of Earth's application for coalition observer status, which Reyes later explained, walking out of the chamber, was diplomatic language for something Earth's ambassadors had been trying and failing to secure for the better part of 2 years. "You did more for Earth standing in one afternoon than our entire diplomatic corps managed in 24 months, Reyes said, once they were finally back in the corridor, away from cameras and delegates, and the low, continuous murmur of 40 species trying to agree on anything. Wasn't trying to do diplomacy, was trying to keep a princess alive and not get shot. I know, that's kind of the point, Rourke. You weren't performing for anybody. Nobody up there could find an angle to be cynical about because there wasn't one. You just did the job. That's usually how the good ones go, Eli said, and rubbed at his bandaged hand, which had started aching again in the recycled air of the station, and thought, not for the first time that week, about how badly he wanted to be somewhere that smelled like motor oil instead of ozone and diplomatic incense. Home eventually. Colonel Reyes was waiting on the platform when the shuttle finally docked, arms crossed, expression carefully neutral in the way of someone who had spent the last 31 hours assuming the worst and was determined not to show relief until she confirmed it wasn't necessary. She looked him over, the bandaged eyebrow, the burned palm wrapped in gauze, the exhaustion sitting in every line of him, and something in her shoulders finally came down half an inch. "You're alive," she said. "Barely, but technically, yeah." "The princess." "Fine. Better than fine. Currently drafting what I'm told is gonna be a very strongly worded letter to the Coalition Council about arms manufacturers starting wars for profit margins, which, frankly, good for her. And Commander Threx. Kneeling less than he was a few hours ago, but I think that's just 'cause his knees hurt too. Big guy, lot of armor." Reyes almost smiled. Almost. The preliminary reports coming through are calling this the single most successful first-contact diplomatic incident in the history of Earth's coalition relations. Do you have any idea what you just did up there? Mostly rewired some junction boxes and stabbed a guy with a soldering iron for medical reasons, Eli said. Also ran 12 kilometers, which my knee is extremely unhappy about, and I would like that on record for whatever hazard pay situation we're working out here. Reyes actually laughed then, short and surprised, like it had escaped before she decided whether to allow it. "I think we can arrange hazard pay." "Great. Also, I never finished that delivery truck. Fella's probably wondering where his brakes went." "Rourke, you just prevented an interstellar war." "Sure. But somebody's still out there driving around Tuesday with brakes I had halfway apart when your car showed up, and that feels like a more immediate problem to me, personally." He hefted his toolbag lighter now, missing a soldering iron and most of a roll of tape and one very good pair of wire strippers he'd left behind on a dead alien warship, and started walking toward the platform exit, knee clicking in a rhythm that, for the first time in a long time, didn't feel like complaint. It felt like proof he was still moving. "Also," he called back over his shoulder, "I'm gonna need a raise and a nap, possibly in that order." Reyes watched him go, this small, unremarkable, thoroughly ordinary man who had just talked a war commander into kneeling and rewired a dying ship's shields with his bare hands, and somehow still cared more about a stranger's brake job than the diplomatic history he just made, and shook her head, and followed him out. Behind them, through the platform's wide observation window, the Threen escort ship hung in the dark a moment longer before beginning its slow turn away, and if anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed that on its hull, freshly painted beneath the ship's official designation, someone had added a small, unauthorized marking, 3 characters in Threen script that, loosely translated, meant something close to "the one who did not calculate the cost." Eli never saw it. He was already thinking about brakes. If a war almost started because one exhausted mechanic refused to stop halfway through a job, you already know what to do. Hit like, subscribe if you want more of these, and drop a comment telling me which trial you think you'd have survived the least well, because personally, I don't think I'd have made it past the heat chamber. Share this one with somebody who needs a reminder that showing up ordinary is still showing up. See you in the next one.